An 11-year-old boy left his home in Colorado Springs on a Monday afternoon in January 2020. His stepmother said he went to a friend's house. She said he walked out the front door, turned left down the street, and disappeared into the cold winter air. She said she waited for him to come home. She said she called around looking for him. She said she was worried. She said a lot of things, and almost all of them were lies. Because Gannon Stauch never walked to a friend's house that day. Gannon Stauch never left that house alive. And the woman who reported him missing, the woman who cried on camera, the woman who begged the community for help finding him, the woman who wore a t-shirt with his face on it and stood at vigils and hugged his father when he flew home from military deployment. That woman already knew exactly where Gannon was. She knew because she was the one who killed him. This is the story of Gannon Stauch. This is the story of how a stepmother murdered an 11-year-old boy in his own home, spent weeks pretending to search for him, manipulated an entire community, and then drove his body more than 800 miles across the country to dump it under a bridge in Florida. This is also the story of how investigators saw through her lies from the very beginning, how a neighbor's security camera captured the truth she tried to bury, and how a courtroom finally delivered the justice that Gannon deserved. What happened inside that house on Mandan Drive in Colorado Springs on January 27, 2020, is one of the most disturbing cases of child murder in recent American history, and the woman responsible for it would eventually stand trial and attempt one of the most bizarre and desperate defenses anyone has ever seen. Gannon Anthony Stauch was born on October 24, 2008, in South Carolina. He was the son of Al Stauch, a soldier in the United States Army, and Landon Hiut, who would later remarry and become Landon Stauch before the divorce, and then go by her maiden name again. Gannon was, by every account from every person who knew him, an extraordinary kid. Not extraordinary in the way that people sometimes exaggerate after a tragedy, inflating the qualities of the deceased to make the loss seem greater. Gannon was genuinely, authentically, remarkably kind. His teachers described him as the kid who would sit with the lonely child at lunch, the kid who would share his snacks without being asked, the kid who noticed when someone was having a bad day and went out of his way to make them smile. He loved science. He loved video games. He loved the Denver Broncos. He loved his family, his biological mother Landon, his father Al, his older sister, and even his stepmother Letitia, the woman who would eventually take his life. Gannon called her Mom. He trusted her. He lived under her roof while his father was deployed overseas with the Army. He depended on her for meals, for rides to school, for the basic daily care that every child needs and deserves from the adults in their life. And she failed him in the most catastrophic and unforgivable way imaginable. Al Stauch and Letitia. Stauch had married in 2018. Al was a career military man, dedicated to his service, but also deeply devoted to his children. When he was deployed, he entrusted Gannon and his older sister to Letitia's care. This was not an unusual arrangement for military families. Deployments are a reality of military life, and spouses routinely assume primary parenting responsibilities when the service member is away. Al had no reason to believe his children were in danger. Letitia had not shown any overt signs of being a threat to them. She could be strict, she could be moody, she could be difficult, but those qualities, while unpleasant, are not the same as being dangerous. Or so everyone thought. What nobody outside that house on Mandan Drive fully understood was the dynamic that had developed between Letitia and Gannon. According to accounts that would later emerge during the investigation and trial, Letitia resented the children from Al's previous marriage. She viewed them as obstacles, as burdens, as reminders that Al had a life and a family before her. This resentment, which she mostly kept hidden from Al and from the outside world, manifested in increasingly harsh treatment of Gannon in particular. There were reports of Letitia being overly strict with Gannon, of punishing him disproportionately for minor infractions, of singling him out for criticism and discipline, while treating her own daughter from a previous relationship differently. None of this was reported to authorities before Gannon's death. None of it was visible enough to trigger intervention from teachers, neighbors, or family members. It existed in the shadows of a household where appearances were maintained, and the reality behind closed doors was known only to the people inside. January 27, 2020, was a Monday. It was a regular school day, but Gannon had stayed home. The reasons for his absence from school that day would become a subject of investigation, with some accounts suggesting he was feeling unwell, and others suggesting Letitia had kept him home for her own reasons. Whatever the case, Gannon was home that day with Letitia, while Al was deployed and Gannon's sister was at school. What happened inside that house between the morning and the early afternoon of January 27th would only be fully revealed during the trial, but the basic facts are these. At some point during the day, Letitia Stauch attacked Gannon. The attack was not a single impulsive act. It was sustained, brutal, and involved multiple methods of violence. According to the forensic evidence and the prosecution's case, Letitia stabbed Gannon multiple times with a knife. She also struck him with a blunt object. The injuries were extensive and severe. Gannon fought for his life. Evidence of a struggle was found in the home. Blood in multiple rooms, signs of a violent confrontation that moved through different parts of the house. An 11-year-old boy fought against an adult woman who was trying to kill him, and he lost. The precise sequence of events, the exact trigger for the attack, the moment-by-moment timeline of what happened inside that house. These details were pieced together by investigators over the following months. But the outcome was never in doubt from the moment detectives began to seriously examine Letitia's story. Gannon was dead. He had been dead since January 27th, and Letitia knew it because she was the one who killed him. But Letitia Stauch did not call 911. She did not call Al. She did not call Gannon's mother. She did not call the police. Instead, she did something that would define the next several weeks of her life and the investigation. She cleaned up. She attempted to conceal the evidence of what she had done. She cleaned blood from the floors and walls of the home. She moved Gannon's body. And then, hours after she had murdered her stepson, she began constructing an elaborate fiction designed to convince the world that Gannon had simply walked out of the house and vanished. At approximately 7 p.m. on January 27, 2020, Letitia Stauch reported Gannon missing to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. She told deputies that Gannon had left the house that afternoon to go to a friend's house and had not returned. She said she had called the friend's family, and they said Gannon had never arrived. She said she was worried. She said she had no idea where he could be. She was calm but concerned, playing the role of a worried stepmother, with enough skill to get through the initial interaction with law enforcement. Deputies took the report and began the standard procedures for a missing child. They searched the immediate area. They canvassed the neighborhood. They contacted Gannon's friends and their families, and they began to encounter the first of many inconsistencies in Letitia's story. Before we go deeper into this investigation, before we reveal the evidence that ultimately exposed Letitia Stauch's lies and led to one of the most dramatic trials in Colorado history, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you comprehensive, evidence-based investigations into cases that demand to be told. New documentaries every week. Hit that like button and drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you followed this case before? What is your take on stepmothers or stepfathers who harm their partner's children? Now let us get back to the investigation that would unravel everything Letitia Stauch tried to hide. The first major break in the case came not from sophisticated forensic technology or a dramatic confession, but from a neighbor's home security camera. A resident on Mandan Drive had a surveillance system that captured video of the street and the driveways of several nearby homes, including the Stauch residence. When investigators reviewed this footage, what they saw contradicted Letitia's account in a devastating way. The footage showed Letitia's vehicle, a white Tiguan, in the driveway on the afternoon of January 27th. It showed movement around the vehicle at times that were inconsistent with her story about Gannon leaving on foot to walk to a friend's house. Most critically, the footage appeared to show Letitia loading something into the back of the vehicle, something large enough and heavy enough to require effort. The footage was grainy and shot from a distance, but to investigators who were already growing suspicious of Letitia's account, it was a significant piece of evidence. It suggested that rather than Gannon leaving the house on foot, something or someone had been placed in Letitia's vehicle. The timing of this activity on the footage corresponded with the period after Gannon was last known to be alive and before Letitia reported him missing. Investigators also noted that Letitia's vehicle had been driven that afternoon, departing the house and returning before she made the missing persons report. Where had she gone? What had she been doing? And what had been in the back of that vehicle? As the days passed and Gannon was not found, the community of Colorado Springs rallied in a way that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Hundreds of volunteers joined search parties, combing through parks, open spaces, and neighborhoods looking for any sign of the missing boy. Flyers were distributed. Social media campaigns were launched. Local businesses posted Gannon's picture in their windows. The community did what communities do when a child goes missing. They came together, they mobilized, and they refused to give up hope. And through all of it, Letitia Stauch was there. She attended vigils. She spoke to reporters. She posted on social media. She wore t-shirts with Gannon's face printed on them. She hugged volunteers and thanked them for their efforts. She played the part of the anguished stepmother with a commitment that was chilling in retrospect, knowing what she had done. She even gave interviews to local television stations, looking directly into the camera and pleading for Gannon's safe return, all while knowing that Gannon would never return because Gannon was already dead and she was the one who had killed him. The audacity of this performance cannot be overstated. This woman stood in front of cameras, surrounded by people who were genuinely devastated by the disappearance of a child, and she lied. She lied with tears in her eyes. She lied with conviction in her voice. She lied while wearing the face of her victim on her chest. And for a time, some people believed her. But not everyone. Gannon's biological mother, Landon Hiott, was suspicious of Letitia from the very beginning. Landon knew her son. She knew he would not simply wander off without telling someone where he was going. She knew the story did not make sense. And as more details emerged about the circumstances of Gannon's disappearance, Landon's suspicion hardened into certainty. She began speaking publicly about her doubts, carefully at first, then with increasing directness as the evidence mounted. Landon's advocacy for her son, her refusal to accept the narrative Letitia was selling, her insistence that investigators look harder and dig deeper, became a driving force in the investigation. She was Gannon's voice when Gannon could no longer speak for himself, and she would not be silenced. Al Stauch, Gannon's father, was in a uniquely painful position. He was deployed overseas when Gannon disappeared. He had to process the news that his son was missing while thousands of miles from home, unable to join the search, unable to look Letitia in the eye and demand the truth. When Al was finally able to return to Colorado Springs, the investigation was already well underway, and the focus had already shifted from a missing child case to a potential homicide investigation with his wife as the primary suspect. The emotional toll on Al was immeasurable. He had trusted Letitia with the most precious things in his life, his children, and that trust had been weaponized against his son. Investigators from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office were building their case methodically and carefully. They knew that Letitia's story was falling apart, but they also knew that building a murder case without a body is one of the most challenging tasks in law enforcement. They needed more than inconsistencies and suspicious behavior. They needed evidence, and they were finding it. The search of the Stauch home, conducted under a warrant, revealed what investigators had feared. Despite Letitia's attempts to clean up, forensic technicians found blood evidence in multiple areas of the house. Blood in the living room, blood in a bathroom, blood in Gannon's bedroom. The pattern and distribution of the blood evidence told a story of violence that had moved through the house, consistent with a prolonged attack and a victim who had tried to flee or resist. Luminol testing, which causes blood to fluoresce even after it has been cleaned, revealed the true extent of the bloodshed. Letitia had scrubbed and cleaned, but she could not erase what had happened. The blood was there, invisible to the naked eye but glowing under the blue light of the forensic technician's lamp, a silent testimony to the horror that had occurred in that house. DNA testing confirmed that the blood found in the home belonged to Gannon. This was the critical forensic link that transformed the case from a suspicious disappearance into a confirmed homicide investigation. The amount and distribution of blood found in the house was consistent with a fatal assault. No one could lose that much blood and survive. Gannon had been killed in that house, and the physical evidence proved it. But the question remained, where was Gannon's body? Letitia was not talking. She had hired an attorney and was refusing to cooperate with investigators. She maintained her story that Gannon had left the house and never returned. She denied any involvement in his disappearance. She denied that the blood in the house was significant, attempting to explain it away as the result of a nosebleed or a minor injury. But the forensic evidence told a different story, and investigators were not buying her explanations. The break in locating Gannon's body came from an unexpected direction. On March 18, 2020, nearly 2 months after Gannon's disappearance, maintenance workers in Pace, Florida, a small town in the Florida Panhandle, more than 800 miles from Colorado Springs, discovered human remains under a bridge near a highway. The remains were those of a child. They had been placed inside a suitcase. When Florida authorities contacted Colorado investigators, the connection was made almost immediately. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. The remains were those of Gannon Stauch. The discovery raised immediate and obvious questions. How did Gannon's body end up in Florida? The answer, investigators determined, was that Letitia had driven there. Phone records, toll records, and surveillance footage placed Letitia on a cross-country drive in the days following Gannon's disappearance. She had loaded Gannon's body into her vehicle and driven more than 800 miles across multiple states to dispose of his remains in a location she believed would never be connected to her. The cold-blooded calculation of this act is almost incomprehensible. This was not a panicked disposal of evidence in the immediate aftermath of a crime. This was a planned, deliberate, multi-day journey undertaken for the sole purpose of hiding a child's body as far from the crime scene as possible. Letitia had driven through Kansas, through Oklahoma, through Texas, through Louisiana, through Mississippi, through Alabama, and into Florida. With the body of her 11-year-old stepson in the vehicle, she had stopped for gas. She had stopped for food. She had driven through traffic and past other motorists, all while carrying the remains of a murdered child. The sheer depravity of this journey, the normalcy of the actions surrounding it, the gas station stops, the highway driving, the mundane routine of a road trip, juxtaposed with the horror of what was in that vehicle, is one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case. Quick pause. If Gannon's story has affected you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you have not already. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps more people see this case and hear Gannon's story. Now let me tell you about the arrest, the trial, and the absolutely insane defense that Letitia Stauch tried to use. On March 2nd, 2020, before Gannon's body had even been found, Letitia Stauch was arrested in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. She had fled Colorado and was traveling through the southeastern United States when law enforcement caught up with her. The arrest was the result of weeks of investigation and the accumulation of evidence that left no doubt about her involvement in Gannon's death. The blood evidence in the home, the neighbor's security camera footage, the phone and toll records showing her cross-country drive, the inconsistencies in her statements, the forensic evidence recovered from her vehicle, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Letitia Stauch had murdered Gannon Stauch and had spent weeks trying to cover it up. Letitia was extradited back to Colorado to face trial. The pretrial period was marked by a series of delays, some caused by the COVID-19 pandemic that had shut down courtrooms across the country, and some caused by the defense's own maneuvering. Letitia went through multiple attorneys. She made bizarre statements in court. She wrote rambling letters from jail. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, leading to questions about her mental competency to stand trial. A competency evaluation was ordered, and after examination, Letitia was found competent to stand trial. She understood the charges against her. She understood the legal proceedings. She was capable of assisting in her own defense. Whatever her behavior might suggest, she was legally sane and fit to face a jury. The trial of Letitia Stauch began on April 3, 2023. more than 3 years after Gannon's murder. The courtroom in the 4th Judicial District Court in Colorado Springs was packed. Media from across the country had descended on the city to cover a case that had captured national attention. Gannon's family, his mother Landon, his father Al, and other relatives, sat in the gallery, their faces etched with the pain of 3 years of grief and the anxiety of finally seeing the legal process they had waited so long for. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Allen and his team, presented a meticulous and devastating case. They walked the jury through every piece of evidence, starting with the timeline of January 27th and the neighbor's security camera footage that contradicted Letatia's account. They presented the blood evidence found in the home, the DNA results confirming it was Gannon's blood, and the forensic analysis showing the extent of the violence. They presented the phone records and toll data tracing Letatia's cross-country drive to Florida. They presented the discovery of Gannon's remains in Pace, Florida, and the autopsy results detailing the horrific injuries he had suffered. The medical examiner testified that Gannon had been stabbed multiple times. He had suffered blunt force trauma. He had been shot. The sheer variety of methods used to kill this child suggested a sustained and frenzied attack that had gone on for an extended period. Gannon had not died quickly. He had suffered, he had fought, and he had lost. The prosecution also presented evidence of Letatia's behavior in the weeks following the murder. Her public performances at vigils and in media interviews, her social media posts, her lies to investigators, her cross-country drive to dispose of Gannon's body. All of it was laid out for the jury in painstaking detail, creating a portrait of a woman who had not only murdered a child, but had then conducted an elaborate and sustained campaign of deception to avoid accountability. The contrast between Letatia's public persona, the tearful, worried stepmother, and the reality revealed by the evidence, a cold, calculating killer, was stark and damning. And then it was the defense's turn. And what happened next was one of the most bizarre and widely ridiculed defense strategies in modern criminal trial history. Letitia Stauch took the witness stand in her own defense. Against the advice of her attorneys, she insisted on testifying. And the story she told was not merely implausible, it was delusional. Letitia claimed that she had not killed Gannon. She claimed that a group of people, including members of a secret organization, had broken into the house and attacked both her and Gannon. She claimed she had been knocked unconscious during the attack, and when she woke up, Gannon was gone. She claimed that the blood in the house was from the intruder's assault on her, not from an attack on Gannon. But that was only the beginning of the bizarre testimony. Letitia went on to claim that she had been communicating with God and with various spiritual entities throughout the ordeal. She claimed that God had spoken to her directly, giving her instructions. She claimed that she was a chosen vessel, a prophet, a person of special spiritual significance who had been targeted by dark forces. She claimed that Gannon was not actually dead, that he had been taken by these forces and was alive somewhere, being held for purposes she could not fully explain. She rambled. She contradicted herself. She became emotional, then calm, then agitated, then serene. She quoted scripture. She made accusations against her own attorneys, against the judge, against the prosecutors, against the investigators. She presented a version of events that bore no resemblance to reality, and that was contradicted by every single piece of physical evidence in the case. The jury watched this testimony with a mixture of disbelief and revulsion. The prosecutors did not need to do much during cross-examination. Letitia's own words were more damaging than anything the prosecution could have asked. She had taken the stand, expecting to convince the jury of her innocence, and instead had provided them with a front-row demonstration of her capacity for fabrication and manipulation. Her testimony was not the performance of a mentally ill woman who genuinely believed what she was saying. It was the desperate, flailing attempt of a guilty woman to create any narrative, no matter how absurd, that might introduce enough doubt to avoid conviction. It did not work. Closing arguments were delivered on May 5th, 2023. The prosecution's closing was systematic and devastating. Walking the jury through the evidence one final time and asking them to compare the mountain of forensic proof with the fantastical story Letitia had told on the witness stand. The defense's closing was brief and subdued. a last attempt to raise reasonable doubt that even the defense attorneys seemed to know was futile. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the utter failure of the defense's strategy. On May 8, 2023, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, tampering with physical evidence. The courtroom erupted. Gannon's family wept with relief. Landon Hyatt, who had fought for her son from the moment he disappeared, who had never believed Letitia's lies, who had pushed and pushed and pushed for justice, finally heard the word she had been waiting more than 3 years to hear: guilty. Letitia showed little visible reaction to the verdict. The woman who had performed so convincingly at vigils and in front of cameras sat stone-faced as the jury's decision was announced. Whether this was shock, resignation, or simply the exhaustion of a woman who had run out of lies to tell, only she knows. The sentencing hearing took place shortly after the verdict. Under Colorado law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no discretion for the judge, no possibility of leniency, no option for a lesser sentence. Letitia Stauch would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Before the sentence was imposed, Gannon's family was given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. Landon Hyatt approached the podium and spoke directly to the court about her son. She described the boy Gannon had been, his kindness, his humor, his love of life. She described the devastation of losing him, the agony of not knowing where he was for weeks, the horror of learning how he had died. She spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried more power than any shout could have. She did not address Letitia directly. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said to Letitia had been said by the jury. Landon spoke to the court, and through the cameras, to the world, about who Gannon was and what his loss meant. Al Stauch also spoke, his words heavy with the particular grief of a father who had trusted the wrong person with his child's safety. He spoke of the guilt he carried, the what-ifs that haunted him every day. What if he had not deployed? What if he had seen the signs? What if he had made different choices? These are the questions that will follow Al Stauch for the rest of his life. Questions that have no satisfying answers because the fault does not lie with a father who served his country. The fault lies with a woman who took a child's life and then spent weeks pretending to search for him. Judge Gregory Werner imposed the mandatory sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. He added consecutive sentences for the other convictions, ensuring that even in the unlikely event of a successful appeal on one charge, Letitia would remain in prison for the rest of her life. The judge's remarks were measured but pointed. He noted the extreme cruelty of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, the calculated nature of the cover-up, and the defendant's complete lack of genuine remorse. Letitia was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Gannon's family. She did not say a word. The woman who had so much to say on the witness stand, who had claimed to be in communication with God, who had spun elaborate fantasies about secret organizations and spiritual warfare, had nothing to say when the reality of her situation finally and irrevocably set in. She would die in prison. What I want you to carry away from this case is not just the horror of what Letitia Stauch did to Gannon. It is the reminder that the people closest to us, the people we trust with our children, our homes, our lives, are not always who they appear to be. Letitia Stauch was a wife, a stepmother, a member of a community. She went to school events. She drove Gannon to activities. She sat at the dinner table with him. She appeared to the outside world as a normal, functioning parent. And behind closed doors, she harbored a resentment so deep and a capacity for violence so extreme that it ultimately consumed an innocent child. There were no dramatic warning signs. There was no moment where the community could have looked at Letitia and said, "That woman is dangerous." The evil was hidden, buried beneath layers of normalcy and routine, and it did not reveal itself until it was too late. This is what makes cases like Gannon's so terrifying. Not just the violence itself, but the ordinariness of the context in which it occurred. A suburban house on a quiet street, a military family dealing with deployment, a stepmother caring for her husband's children. These are the most unremarkable circumstances imaginable. And within those unremarkable circumstances, a child was murdered. Gannon Anthony Stauch was 11 years old when he died. He was born on October 24, 2008, and he was killed on January 27, 2020. He loved science and video games and the Denver Broncos. He was kind to everyone he met. He had a smile that could light up a room and a heart that was bigger than his small frame could contain. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to go to middle school and high school and college. He deserved to fall in love and get a job and have children of his own someday. He deserved all the ordinary, beautiful, mundane milestones of a human life. He got none of them. His life was stolen by someone he trusted, someone he called Mom, someone who was supposed to protect him. And while justice has been served in the legal sense, while LaTesha Stauch will spend the rest of her life in prison, no verdict can undo what was done. No sentence can bring Gannon back. No amount of accountability can fill the void left by his absence. All we can do is remember him, remember his name, remember his smile, remember that he mattered. And remember that behind the closed doors of ordinary homes, on quiet streets in safe neighborhoods, there are children who need us to pay attention. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. And most importantly, if you see something, say something. Gannon's story did not have to end this way. Nobody's should. Thank you for watching. These are not just stories. These are real lives, real tragedies, and real families that will carry this pain forever. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never stop fighting for the ones who cannot fight for themselves. But before we end, let us go back and examine some of the details of this case more closely, because there are aspects of LaTesha Stauch's behavior before, during, and after the murder that reveal the full depth of her calculation and depravity. In the weeks leading up to January 27th, LaTesha had been showing increasing signs of frustration and hostility toward Gannon. Text messages recovered from her phone showed her complaining about Gannon's behavior to friends and family, describing him as difficult, disobedient, and a burden. She used language that, in retrospect, revealed a woman who did not see her stepson as a child to be nurtured, but as an obstacle to be managed. One particularly telling message, sent just days before the murder, described Gannon in terms that no loving parent would use about an 11-year-old child. Investigators would later point to these messages as evidence of the growing resentment that ultimately exploded into violence on January 27th. There were also indications that LaTesha had been planning something. In the days before the murder, she had searched the internet for topics that, in isolation, might seem innocent, but in context were deeply incriminating. She had researched methods of cleaning blood from surfaces. She had searched for information about how long DNA evidence remains detectable. She had looked up the penalties for various crimes in Colorado. These searches, recovered from her phone and computer during the investigation, painted a picture of a woman who was not acting on impulse, but was thinking ahead, considering the consequences, and preparing for what she was about to do. The prosecution would later present these searches as evidence of premeditation, proof that LaTesha had planned to kill Gannon and had taken deliberate steps to prepare for the cover-up. The events of January 27th itself were reconstructed through a combination of physical evidence, digital forensics, and the neighbor's security camera footage. In the morning, Gannon was alive and apparently going about his normal routine inside the house. LaTesha's phone records showed that she was also in the house throughout the morning. At some point in the late morning or early afternoon, the attack began. The exact trigger, if there was one, has never been definitively established. It may have been an argument. It may have been something trivial that LaTesha magnified in her mind into an unforgivable offense. Or it may have been something she had been planning and simply decided to execute that day. Whatever the catalyst, the violence was extreme. Gannon was stabbed repeatedly. The forensic evidence showed wounds to his torso, his arms, and his hands, the last of which were consistent with defensive wounds, meaning Gannon had raised his hands to try to protect himself from the knife. He had fought back. He had struggled. An 11-year-old boy had looked at the woman he called Mom as she attacked him with a knife, and he had tried to defend himself. He had tried to live, and he had failed. After the stabbing, there was evidence of blunt force trauma. Gannon had been struck with a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool, and there was evidence that he had been shot. The combination of methods, stabbing, bludgeoning, and shooting, suggested an attack of extraordinary ferocity, one that went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. This overkill, as forensic psychologists call it, is often indicative of a deeply personal crime, one driven by rage, hatred, or a desire to utterly destroy the victim. It is not the behavior of someone acting in the heat of a single moment. It is the behavior of someone unleashing a fury that has been building for a long time. After Gannon was dead, Letitia faced the problem that every killer faces: what to do with the body and how to explain the victim's absence. Her solution was methodical and cold-blooded. First, she cleaned the house. She scrubbed blood from floors, walls, and furniture. She laundered bedding and clothing. She attempted to remove every visible trace of what had happened. She was largely successful in this effort, at least to the naked eye. When investigators later entered the home, it appeared clean and orderly. It was only under forensic examination, with luminol and alternative light sources, that the true extent of the blood evidence was revealed. Second, she removed Gannon's body from the house and placed it in her vehicle. This was likely the activity captured on the neighbor's security camera, the footage showing Letitia loading something large and heavy into the back of her white Tiguan. Third, she drove. Initially, she did not drive all the way to Florida. Evidence suggested that she first took Gannon's body to a temporary location, possibly storing it in the vehicle or at another site, while she figured out her next steps. Over the following days, she made the decision to transport the body out of state, far from Colorado Springs, far from the search area, far from anyone who might connect the remains to the missing boy. The drive to Florida was a journey of approximately 1,300 miles, depending on the route. Letitia drove through multiple states over the course of 2 or 3 days. She stopped for gas. She stopped for food. She may have stayed at a motel. She drove through cities and towns, past millions of people, carrying the body of a murdered child in her vehicle, and nobody noticed. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned why a woman from Colorado was driving alone through the deep South with a suitcase in her trunk. The banality of the journey, the ordinariness of the highway driving and the gas station stops, stands in grotesque contrast to the cargo she was carrying. When she reached Pace, Florida, a small community in Santa Rosa County, she selected a bridge near a highway as her disposal site. She placed Gannon's remains, which had been packed into a suitcase, under the bridge and left. Then she turned around and drove back, retracing her route across the South, through the Midwest, and back to Colorado Springs, where she resumed her performance as the worried stepmother of a missing child. The discovery of Gannon's body on March 18, 2020, was the result of routine maintenance work near the bridge. Workers noticed the suitcase and, upon opening it, discovered the remains. Local law enforcement was called, and the remains were quickly connected to the nationwide search for Gannon Stauch. The condition of the remains was consistent with a body that had been deceased for approximately 7 weeks, matching the timeline of Gannon's disappearance. The autopsy conducted in Florida confirmed the cause of death and documented the extensive injuries Gannon had suffered. The findings were consistent with the blood evidence found in the Stauch home, completing the forensic circle that connected the crime scene in Colorado Springs to the disposal site in Florida. The trial itself was a spectacle that drew national media attention, not just for the severity of the crime, but for the extraordinary behavior of the defendant. Throughout the proceedings, Letitia alternated between periods of apparent cooperation and outbursts of bizarre behavior. She interrupted the judge on multiple occasions. She argued with her own attorneys. She attempted to fire her legal team and represent herself, a request that the judge denied. She made claims about government conspiracies, about being targeted by intelligence agencies, about having special knowledge of events that nobody else could understand. Her behavior raised genuine questions about her mental state, but the competency evaluations consistently found her fit to stand trial. The consensus among the mental health professionals who examined her was that Letitia was not psychotic or delusional in a clinical sense. She was manipulative. She was narcissistic. She was desperate. And she was willing to say or do anything to avoid the consequences of her actions. The prosecution called more than 100 witnesses over the course of the trial. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence, the DNA analysis, the digital forensics, and the autopsy findings. Investigators testified about the timeline of events, the inconsistencies in Letitia's statements, and the evidence recovered from her home and vehicle. Neighbors testified about what they had seen and heard. Teachers and friends testified about who Gannon was, painting a portrait of a kind and gentle boy whose life had been cut short by the one person who should have been protecting him. The defense called relatively few witnesses, relying primarily on Letitia's own testimony, which, as described earlier, devolved into a rambling, incoherent narrative that did more harm than good to her case. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came during the prosecution's presentation of Gannon's last moments. Using the physical evidence, the blood spatter analysis, the wound patterns documented in the autopsy, and the layout of the Stauch home, the prosecution reconstructed the sequence of the attack. They showed the jury where Gannon had been when the attack began. They showed where he had tried to run. They showed where he had fallen. They showed the trail of blood through the house that documented his desperate attempt to escape. And they showed where he had finally died, in his own home, at the hands of his own stepmother. The jury sat in absolute silence during this presentation. Several jurors were visibly emotional. The reality of what had happened to Gannon, rendered in forensic detail and physical evidence, was almost unbearable to contemplate. An 11-year-old boy had been hunted through his own home by the woman who was supposed to be caring for him. He had tried to get away. He had tried to survive. And he had died terrified, in pain, and alone. The emotional weight of the trial extended beyond the courtroom walls. In Colorado Springs, a community that had rallied to search for Gannon, that had plastered his face on flyers and worn his name on their shirts, watched the proceedings with a collective sense of horror and vindication. Restaurants and coffee shops that had served as meeting points for search volunteers now had their televisions tuned to the trial coverage. People who had never met Gannon felt personally invested in the outcome. There was a shared sense that this trial was not just about one family's tragedy, but about the community's own failure to protect one of its youngest members. The guilt was irrational, but real. People wondered if they had missed something. If they had driven past the Stauch house on January 27th, could they have heard something? If they had paid more attention to the dynamics of that household, could they have intervened? These are the questions that haunt communities after a child is murdered, and Colorado Springs was grappling with them in real time as the trial unfolded. The media coverage of the trial was extensive and often sensationalized, but certain moments cut through the noise and delivered genuine emotional impact. One such moment came when the prosecution played audio from a jailhouse phone call between Letitia and a family member. In the call, recorded months after her arrest, Letitia discussed the case in terms that revealed her primary concern was not Gannon's death, but her own predicament. She complained about the conditions in jail. She complained about her attorneys. She complained about the media coverage. She expressed frustration that people were believing the prosecution's narrative rather than hers. At no point in the call did she express sorrow for Gannon. At no point did she say she missed him. At no point did she acknowledge that an 11-year-old boy was dead. The call was played in the courtroom, and the contrast between Letitia's self-pity and the family's grief was devastating. Landon Heath sat in the gallery, listening to the woman who had killed her son complain about her own discomfort, and the pain on her face was visible to everyone in the room. It was a moment that crystallized what the entire trial had been demonstrating. Letitia Stauch was incapable of seeing beyond her own needs and desires. Gannon had never been a person to her. He had been an inconvenience, and when that inconvenience became intolerable, she had eliminated it with the same cold efficiency with which one might throw away a piece of broken furniture. Another pivotal moment in the trial came during the testimony of Harley Stauch, Letitia's teenage daughter from a previous relationship. Harley had been living in the Stauch household at the time of Gannon's disappearance, though she had been at school on the day of the murder. Harley's testimony was guarded and clearly painful. She described the household dynamic, confirming that Letitia had been increasingly harsh toward Gannon in the months before his death. She described instances where Leticia had punished Gannon for trivial offenses, where she had yelled at him for things that did not merit anger, where the atmosphere in the house had become tense and unpredictable whenever Gannon and Leticia were in the same room. Harley's testimony was not the dramatic bombshell that some observers had hoped for. She did not describe witnessing abuse that crossed clearly criminal lines. She did not provide the prosecution with a smoking gun, but what she did provide was context. She filled in the picture of a household where Gannon was increasingly unwelcome, where the adult who was supposed to care for him viewed him with barely concealed contempt, and where the conditions for violence were slowly but inevitably building toward the explosion that occurred on January 27th. The defense's cross-examination of prosecution witnesses was largely ineffective, hampered by the overwhelming weight of the physical evidence and by the defendant's own insistence on pursuing a strategy that her attorneys clearly did not endorse. At several points during the trial, Leticia could be seen passing notes to her attorneys, apparently suggesting questions or lines of argument that the attorneys would read, shake their heads at, and set aside. The disconnect between the defendant and her legal team was visible and awkward, a clear sign that Leticia was not willing to accept the reality of her situation or the limitations of what any defense attorney could accomplish given the evidence against her. The prosecution also addressed the question of motive, a subject that had been debated extensively in the media and among true crime followers since Gannon's disappearance. Why would a stepmother murder her 11-year-old stepson? The prosecution's answer was rooted in the psychology of resentment and narcissism. They argued that Leticia had never fully accepted the blended family structure that her marriage to Al required. She wanted Al's attention, his resources, and his devotion entirely for herself. Gannon and his sister were competitors for those things, reminders of Al's previous life and previous family. As long as the children were in the house, Leticia could never be the center of Al's universe. This resentment, the prosecution argued, had been building for months and had finally erupted into lethal violence. They presented the text messages, the internet searches, and the witness testimony as evidence of this escalating hostility. They painted a portrait of a woman who had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that Gannon was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The defense offered an alternative explanation, though it was overshadowed by Leticia's own testimony. The defense psychologist suggested that Leticia suffered from a dissociative disorder, that she had experienced a psychological break on January 27th and had committed the murder while in a dissociative state, essentially arguing that she was not in control of her actions at the time of the killing. This argument was undercut by the extensive evidence of premeditation, the internet searches, the planning, the cover-up, all of which demonstrated a mind that was very much in control and very much aware of what it was doing. The jury rejected the dissociative disorder defense, as they rejected every other aspect of the defense's case. Let us also talk about the impact this case had on military families specifically, because this was a dimension that received significant attention during and after the trial. Al Stauch was deployed when Gannon was killed. He was serving his country overseas, trusting that his family was safe at home. This is the fundamental bargain that military families make. One parent goes into harm's way while the other maintains the home front. It is an arrangement built entirely on trust, and Leticia's betrayal of that trust struck a particular nerve within the military community. After the trial, advocacy groups for military families called for enhanced support systems for children in military households, including more frequent check-ins from family readiness groups, improved communication channels between deployed parents and schools, and greater awareness among military leadership of the unique stressors that blended military families face. Some advocates proposed that the military itself should play a more active role in monitoring the welfare of service members' children during deployments, rather than relying solely on the non-deployed spouse or partner. These proposals remain under discussion, but they reflect a genuine concern that the Gannon-Stauch case exposed. When a parent deploys, their children are vulnerable. They are dependent on the adults who remain behind. And if those adults are not trustworthy, the deployed parent has no way of knowing until it is too late. The sentencing phase of the trial also included testimony from law enforcement officials who described the impact of the case on the investigators themselves. The lead detective in the case testified that Gannon's murder was the most difficult case of his career, not because of the complexity of the investigation, but because of the emotional toll of spending months immersed in the details of a child's violent death. He described sleepless nights, strained relationships, and a persistent sense of heaviness that did not lift even after the arrest and conviction. Other officers who had been involved in the case echoed these sentiments. One young deputy, who had been among the first responders to the Stausch home during the initial missing persons report, described the moment he realized that the woman standing in front of him, the woman who was tearfully describing her missing stepson, was almost certainly responsible for the child's death. He said he had to maintain his composure, to continue treating the interaction as a routine missing persons case, even as every instinct told him something was terribly wrong. The discipline required to do that, to stand face to face with a killer and not reveal your suspicions, is something that most people will never have to experience. But it is a daily reality for law enforcement officers, and it takes a psychological toll that is often invisible and rarely acknowledged. The aftermath of the trial also saw a reckoning within the El Paso County school system. Questions were raised about whether Gannon's school had done enough to monitor his well-being during the period when his father was deployed. Teachers at Gannon's school had noticed changes in his behavior in the weeks before his death. He had been quieter than usual. He had seemed withdrawn. He had missed several days of school. In isolation, none of these signs were alarming enough to trigger a formal intervention. Children go through quiet phases. Children sometimes withdraw when a parent is deployed. Children miss school for legitimate reasons. But in retrospect, these subtle changes took on a darker significance. They were the visible symptoms of a household that was becoming increasingly dangerous for a child, and nobody connected the dots until it was too late. School officials defended their actions, pointing out that none of Gannon's teachers had observed signs of physical abuse, and that the behavioral changes, while noted, were within the range of normal for a child dealing with a parent's deployment. They were right, in a technical sense. The signs were ambiguous. They could have indicated many things. But the case prompted the school district to review its protocols for monitoring children from military families and to provide additional training for teachers on recognizing the subtle signs of abuse and neglect. These changes, while too late for Gannon, may help protect other children in the future. The digital forensics in this case also set important precedents for future investigations. The recovery of Letitia's internet searches, phone records, and social media activity played a crucial role in establishing premeditation and documenting the cover-up. In an era where virtually every aspect of our lives leaves a digital footprint, criminals like Letitia Stausch cannot erase their tracks as easily as they might think. Every Google search is logged. Every phone call leaves a record. Every cell tower ping creates a data point that can place a person at a specific location at a specific time. Leticia had tried to delete her search history and had taken steps to conceal her digital activity. But forensic technicians were able to recover much of what she had attempted to erase. The lesson for law enforcement is clear. Digital evidence is as important as physical evidence in modern criminal investigations, and agencies must invest in the training and technology needed to recover and analyze it effectively. The lesson for criminals, if they are capable of learning, is equally clear. The internet does not forget. Your phone does not forget. And no matter how many times you press delete, the truth is still there, waiting to be found. There is also the matter of Letitia's behavior on social media during the weeks between Gannon's disappearance and her arrest. While she was publicly playing the role of the worried stepmother, she was also active on social media, posting updates about the search, responding to comments, and engaging with the community of people who were trying to find Gannon. Some of these posts were straightforward appeals for help. Others were more calculated, subtle attempts to steer the narrative away from herself and toward other suspects or theories. She hinted that Gannon might have been taken by a stranger. She suggested that the neighborhood was not as safe as people thought. She even implied that Gannon's biological mother might know more than she was saying, an accusation that was as baseless as it was cruel. Social media has become a battleground in modern criminal cases, a place where suspects can try to shape public perception and where investigators can gather evidence of consciousness, of guilt. Letitia's social media activity fell into both categories. Her posts were simultaneously an attempt to manipulate and a record of her manipulation, a digital trail that prosecutors used to demonstrate the depth and duration of her deception. In the years since the trial, Gannon's family has worked to establish lasting memorials to his memory. A scholarship fund was created in Gannon's name, providing financial assistance to students who embody the qualities that Gannon was known for: kindness, curiosity, and a willingness to help others. Community events have been organized in his honor, including annual walks and awareness campaigns focused on child safety. The Gannon Stauch Foundation, established by his family, works to support children in military families and to advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable youth. These efforts are a testament to the family's determination to transform their grief into something positive, to ensure that Gannon's legacy is defined not by how he died, but by who he was, and the good that continues to be done in his name. Landon Hiott has been particularly outspoken about the need for systemic change. In interviews and public appearances, she has argued that the current system for monitoring the welfare of children in blended families and military households is inadequate. She has called for mandatory check-ins for children whose parents are deployed, for enhanced training for school counselors and teachers, and for greater accountability for non-biological caregivers. Her advocacy is driven by a simple and devastating conviction. If the systems had been better, if the safety nets had been stronger, if someone, anyone, had looked a little closer at what was happening inside that house on Mandan Drive, her son might still be alive. She carries that knowledge with her every day, and she channels it into a fight for the children who can still be saved. Al Stauch has been more private in his grief, but no less affected. He has spoken about the guilt that haunts him, the knowledge that he was thousands of miles away when his son needed him most. He has spoken about the difficulty of trusting anyone again, of rebuilding a life after the person he married turned out to be capable of murdering his child. He has spoken about the moments that catch him off guard, a song Gannon liked on the radio, a Broncos game that Gannon would have loved, a science documentary that would have had Gannon glued to the screen. These are the small, everyday reminders of absence that constitute the real, lived experience of grief, the moments that no trial and no verdict can touch. Gannon Stauch's case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of domestic child homicide in modern American history. It is a case that exposes the limits of our ability to protect children from the people closest to them. It is a case that reveals the terrifying gap between appearance and reality in seemingly normal households. And it is a case that demonstrates the extraordinary lengths to which a guilty person will go to avoid accountability. From cleaning up a crime scene to driving a body 800 miles across the country, to standing on a witness stand and claiming to be a prophet of God, Letitia Stauch did all of these things. And none of them saved her from the truth. The truth found Gannon's blood in the house she tried to clean. The truth found his body under a bridge in Florida. The truth found her on a neighbor's security camera. The truth followed her digital footprint across the internet. And the truth sat in a jury box and pronounced her guilty on every single count. The truth is patient. The truth is persistent. And the truth, eventually, always wins. After the conviction and sentencing, the legal proceedings were largely concluded, but the impact of the case continued to reverberate through the community and beyond. Gannon's Law was proposed in Colorado, a piece of legislation designed to strengthen protections for children living with non-biological caregivers. The law would require enhanced background checks and monitoring for step-parents and other non-biological guardians in certain circumstances. While the legislation has faced challenges in the political process, its proposal reflected the community's determination to ensure that Gannon's death would lead to meaningful change in how we protect vulnerable children. The case also prompted a broader conversation about the unique risks faced by children in blended families. While the vast majority of step-parents are loving and caring individuals, statistics show that children are disproportionately at risk of abuse and homicide when living with non-biological caregivers. This is not an indictment of step-parents as a group, but it is a reality that child welfare professionals and law enforcement agencies must grapple with. The Gannon Stauch case became a focal point for these discussions, forcing uncomfortable questions about how we screen, monitor, and support the adults who care for our children. Landon Hiatt, Gannon's mother, has continued to advocate for children's safety in the years since the trial. She has spoken at events, participated in documentaries, and used her platform to raise awareness about child abuse and the importance of vigilance. She has spoken openly about her grief, about the anger she carries, and about her determination to ensure that Gannon's memory serves a larger purpose. She has also spoken about the particular pain of knowing that her son died, calling out for help that never came, that he spent his final moments in terror and agony, and that the person who inflicted that suffering was someone he trusted. Landon's strength in the face of this unimaginable loss has been an inspiration to many, and her advocacy continues to make a difference in the lives of children she will never meet. Gannon's story is ultimately a story about trust. The trust a child places in the adults who care for them. The trust a father places in his wife when he deploys overseas. The trust a community places in its members to treat children with the care and respect they deserve. Letecia Stauch violated every one of those trusts in the most extreme and unforgivable way possible. She took the life of a child who depended on her, and then she stood in front of the world and pretended to be devastated by his loss. The depths of that deception, the coldness of that calculation, the sheer inhumanity of that performance, these are the things that make this case so profoundly disturbing. It is not just that she killed Gannon, it is that she killed him and then pretended to love him. That is a special kind of evil. And it is the kind of evil that reminds us all to pay attention, to ask questions, to look behind the performances that people put on, and to never assume that the people closest to our children are incapable of doing them harm. Rest in peace, Gannon Anthony Stauch. October 24th, 2008 to January 27th, 2020. You were loved, you are missed, and you will never, ever be forgotten. If this investigation has moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear Gannon's story. Subscribe to this channel for new investigations every week. And remember, these are not just cases. These are children. These are families. These are real people whose lives were shattered by violence and betrayal. Until next time, thank you for watching, and never stop fighting for the ones who cannot fight for themselves.